You're done here. Pack your things and don't bother coming back Monday. Marcus Voss said it without looking up from his phone, standing in the middle of the server room like the words cost him nothing at all. Daniel Reyes stood there in his gray work jacket, a laptop still open on the desk in front of him, and said nothing. 6 weeks from that morning, the same man would be standing in a boardroom, begging Daniel to save the only thing he had left. Stay with me to the end. Subscribe, because you will not believe how this one turns out. 3 months earlier, Daniel Reyes had been exactly what everyone assumed him to be, a 41-year-old IT contractor with tired eyes and a toolbox that rattled when he walked. He drove a 10-year-old pickup, took freelance repair jobs around Denver, and picked his daughter Maya up from school every day at 3:15 sharp, rain or shine, because there was no one else who would. His wife had died 4 years earlier, quietly, of an illness that took 18 months to finish what it started, and Daniel had spent every day since rebuilding a life around one 9-year-old girl who still slept with the hallway light on. Their apartment wasn't much, 2 bedrooms above a laundromat, a kitchen table with one wobbly leg he kept meaning to fix, a corkboard covered in Maya's drawings of dinosaurs wearing crowns. But it was steady, and steady was the only thing Daniel had asked of life since the funeral. Every night he checked her homework, made something simple for dinner, and sat on the edge of her bed until she fell asleep, because for the first year after her mother died, she hadn't been able to sleep without someone in the room. He never once told anyone at his jobs about any of it. Clients paid him to fix what was broken, not to know his life story, and he preferred it that way. What none of his clients knew, what he never mentioned on invoices or introduced himself with, was that Daniel had spent 11 years designing intrusion detection systems for a defense contractor outside Colorado Springs, the kind of work that came with a badge, a clearance level, and a signature on documents that didn't officially exist. He'd walked away from it the year his wife got sick, traded classified networks for home Wi-Fi routers and cracked laptop screens, and never looked back. People saw a contractor in a faded jacket and assumed exactly what they were meant to assume. Daniel had learned there was a strange safety in being underestimated. Nobody asks a man they've dismissed to explain himself. The emergency call came on a Tuesday morning, marked urgent, paying triple his usual rate. The company was Halcyon Dynamics, a fast-rising AI and cybersecurity firm occupying 11 floors of glass downtown. Daniel had heard the name in passing, everyone in the tech corridor had, but he'd never had reason to set foot inside until a nervous junior assistant met him at reception, handed him a visitor badge with shaking hands, and warned him in a hushed voice that the machine belonged to the CEO herself, and that 3 technicians before him had already failed and left the building looking, in her words, haunted. Daniel only nodded. He'd once briefed 3-star generals who didn't tolerate excuses. A demanding executive did not concern him. What interested him was the line buried in the service ticket: the machine wasn't just frozen, it was actively rejecting every attempt at repair, as though something inside it knew it was being touched. The office at the end of the hallway held no framed magazine covers, no trophy wall, nothing built to impress a visitor. Just a plain desk, a wall of windows fogged with early rain, and a single terminal glowing faintly in the gray light. Daniel set his bag down, studied the frozen screen for a long moment before touching anything, and began the slow work of listening to what the machine was trying to tell him. Within 20 minutes he found it, 2 overlapping security protocols installed by 2 different departments, neither aware the other existed, quietly fighting each other for control of the same resources. Not a virus. Not an attack. Just an organization so layered with technology that nobody had noticed 2 systems choking each other. He rewrote 3 lines of a configuration file nobody else had thought to examine, and the machine stabilized. When it rebooted, it didn't show a company logo. It showed a photograph, a young woman standing in the rain outside what looked like a university cafe, hair damp and clinging to her forehead, laughing at something just out of frame, caught completely off guard. No makeup, no polish, nothing that matched the composed, untouchable executive every business magazine in the country had built a persona around. Daniel was still looking at it when the door opened behind him and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Vivian Cole entered the way she entered every room, spine straight, gray suit tailored to the inch, an expression built over a decade to give nothing away. She was 36, one of the youngest CEOs in the AI sector, and the moment her eyes found the screen, something flickered behind her composure before she smoothed it back into place. For a long, suspended second, nobody spoke. Then she crossed the room, stopped directly in front of Daniel, and asked the question that would follow both of them for the rest of the year. "Do you think I'm pretty?" The words landed like something dropped from a height. The assistant near the door went still. Vivian Cole did not ask questions like that, not in board meetings, not in press interviews, not ever. Daniel didn't answer right away. He'd learned, in his marriage and in the years after, that some questions were never really about what they seemed to be about. "That photo's beautiful," he finally said, "because the woman in it is happy. That's the only thing making it beautiful. Not the lighting. Not the moment. Just that she was actually happy." Vivian went very still, and for one fraction of a second her jaw trembled before she caught it. In 7 years running that company, dozens of people had called her beautiful. Nobody had ever noticed she wasn't, anymore. She thanked him, formal and rehearsed, and the small crowd that had gathered drifted back to their desks. Before he could gather his tools, she asked him to stay a little longer. She didn't explain why. Daniel agreed before he'd fully decided to. The offer came the next afternoon, a temporary consulting role, vaguely titled, generously paid, delivered through a personal message from Vivian's office rather than HR. It surprised nearly everyone, including Daniel. It did not sit well with Marcus Voss, Halcyon's chief operating officer, a man who had built 10 years of quiet influence inside the company and did not appreciate a stranger with a toolbox suddenly walking freely through executive floors. In meetings Daniel wasn't invited to, Voss called it a security risk. In hallway conversations, he called it something closer to an embarrassment. It came to a head one afternoon in the executive break room, where Voss cornered him in front of 3 other directors, coffee in hand, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. He asked, not quite joking, whether Daniel had a resume anywhere, or whether Halcyon was simply supposed to trust a man who fixed washing machines with sensitive research. A couple of the directors laughed the way people laugh when they want to stay on the winning side of a joke. Daniel set down the mug he'd been rinsing, looked at Voss for a moment longer than was comfortable, and said only that he'd let the work speak for itself. Then he walked out, and said nothing about it to anyone, not even Vivian, when she asked later why the room had gone quiet when she walked in. Daniel let the whispers pass without comment. He'd never cared for office politics, and he cared even less now, because something about the system conflict he'd resolved didn't sit right with him. 2 protocols didn't collide like that by accident. That certainty grew harder a few days later, when Voss directly ordered him to close out the incident report early, sign off on it as a routine software conflict, and hand back his temporary badge by Friday. Voss framed it as a courtesy, sparing a contractor from getting tangled in a company's internal mess, but Daniel had spent too many years reading the difference between a genuine kindness and a door being quietly shut in his face. He said he'd finish the report once he understood the root cause completely, not before, and that he'd rather lose the contract than sign his name to something he hadn't verified. Voss's jaw tightened, but he couldn't overrule a directive that had come, however informally, from Vivian herself. Daniel kept working, quietly, the same way he always had, not out of defiance for its own sake, but because closing a file he didn't trust would have meant lying with his own signature, and that was a line he didn't cross for anyone. The deeper he looked into Halcyon's network in the quiet office they'd given him near the server room, the more that instinct hardened into certainty. Reviewing logs nobody else bothered to check, he found files being accessed at hours no legitimate work justified, routed through channels that bypassed the monitoring software, careful enough that a routine audit would have missed it. Someone inside Halcyon Dynamics was quietly moving proprietary research out the back door, and had been doing it long enough to grow dangerously confident. Daniel said nothing yet. Accusations without proof ended careers as thoroughly as the crimes themselves, and he intended to be certain first. Tracing the intrusion further back, Daniel stumbled onto something that had nothing to do with the breach at all. Buried in an old, rarely accessed archive drive was a folder of personal files belonging to Richard Cole, Vivian's father and the company's founder, untouched since his death 3 years earlier. Most of it was routine, old contracts, early product sketches, until Daniel opened a single letter, dated the year before Richard died, addressed to no one in particular, simply titled, "For whoever finally earns Vivian's trust." In it, Richard wrote about a defense sector engineer he'd once tried to recruit years earlier, a quiet man who'd turned down the offer to stay closer to his family, whose name Richard had never forgotten because the man had solved, in an afternoon, a network problem Richard's own team had called unsolvable. He wrote that if that man, or anyone like him, ever crossed paths with his daughter, she should be told to trust her instincts over the noise of a boardroom, because talent like that rarely announced itself loudly. Daniel read his own old case file number in the margin, half forgotten from a decade-old contract, and sat in the empty office for a long time before he told anyone what he'd found. When he finally showed it to Vivian, she read it twice, silently, and then asked him, voice unsteady for the first time since he'd known her, whether her father had somehow known, all those years ago, that the two of them would end up in the same room. A week later, Vivian showed up unannounced at Daniel's apartment above the laundromat, having gotten the address from an emergency contact form he'd filled out for the consulting role. She stood in the hallway in flats instead of heels, no assistant trailing her, holding a bag of takeout as an excuse. Maya answered the door in socks and immediately asked if she was really the lady from Daniel's phone. Daniel asked for one thing, 24 hours, complete access to the server logs, no interference. Vivian granted it without hesitation. He worked through the night on cold coffee and the hum of servers that never slept. The footage was altered, he was sure of that within the hour, though proving it meant tracing manipulated metadata most people would never think to examine. By morning he'd reconstructed 18 months of deleted access logs, revealing a pattern far older and more deliberate than anyone suspected, proprietary research extracted in small, carefully spaced increments, engineered to avoid tripping any alert. The credentials behind it belonged not to an outside hacker, but to someone deeply embedded in the company. Cross-referencing access times against travel records and internal messages narrowed the list to exactly one name, Marcus Voss, who had spent years quietly selling Halcyon's research to competitors through a network of shell accounts, confident his decade of tenure placed him above suspicion. Confronted with evidence that left no room for argument, Voss's composure finally broke. He tried, at first, to argue that the logs had been fabricated too, that Daniel was covering his own tracks by inventing a scapegoat, but the shell accounts traced directly to personal devices only Voss had ever used, and the confession that followed, once the room fell silent around him, left the board speechless. He admitted to selling 3 years of proprietary research to a rival firm through a chain of intermediaries, admitted he'd altered the security footage himself over a single sleepless weekend when he realized Daniel's audit was getting too close. He was terminated on the spot, escorted out by building security past the same glass walls he'd walked for a decade, and turned over to federal investigators before the week was out. The directors who had so confidently called for Daniel's removal offered quiet, uncomfortable apologies that never quite acknowledged how close they'd come to destroying an innocent man over manufactured footage. One of them, an older board member named Harold Ansel, pulled Daniel aside afterward and admitted, gruffly, that he'd been wrong to doubt him, and that he hoped Daniel understood it wasn't personal, it was simply how boards were trained to think. Daniel told him it was fine. He'd spent enough years being underestimated to know it rarely was personal. It just cost people like him more than it cost anyone else. Vivian said little publicly. Privately, something in her had shifted for good. She had trusted a man she barely knew over an entire boardroom of experienced executives, and that choice had been proven right in the most consequential way imaginable. It left her with a clarity she hadn't expected, a growing sense that her own instincts, buried under years of caution, deserved more room than she'd ever given them. One evening after the company's shaken operations began settling back into rhythm, Vivian found Daniel packing up the last of his equipment and asked him the question that had sat unspoken between them since that first rainy morning: why hadn't he simply told her she was pretty, the way anyone else in his position would have? It would have cost him nothing. Daniel set down the cable in his hands and considered it seriously, the way he considered anything that actually mattered. She hadn't really been asking about her face, he told her. She'd been asking whether anyone still remembered the person she used to be before the boardrooms and the headlines demanded she be flawless in every photograph. Calling her pretty would have answered a question she never asked, and missed the real one entirely. Vivian stood perfectly still, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, tears gathered in her eyes without her trying to hide them. No one had ever asked her that real question before, whether the laughing young woman in the rain still existed somewhere underneath the polished executive everyone believed they knew. Daniel didn't offer comfort dressed up as reassurance. He told her simply that people don't disappear completely, no matter how deep they bury themselves, and that whatever was left of that woman in the photograph was still there, waiting for permission to breathe again. In the months that followed, something in Vivian loosened, quietly and without announcement. She started declining media appearances that existed only to reinforce an image, choosing instead to spend that time on work that actually interested her. She laughed more easily with her staff. The atmosphere on the executive floor grew lighter in ways employees noticed but rarely said out loud. Daniel's consulting role became permanent, head of security architecture, and he never once used his place beside her to seek anything for himself. He never pursued her the way other men in her orbit had always pursued something. That restraint, more than anything he ever said, was what drew her closer than she expected. A year later, on the evening Halcyon celebrated its biggest partnership yet, the deal that finally rebuilt everything the breach had threatened, a photographer asked Vivian to pose for the traditional victory photo beside the company banner. She declined, politely, and crossed the room instead to where Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, exactly where he always preferred to be. She took his hand without a word and led him out to the private balcony, away from the noise, into a soft evening mist. She held up her phone and asked him to simply stand beside her, nothing posed, nothing arranged. She smiled the same unguarded way she had in that photograph years before, and Daniel caught the moment before it passed. They looked at it together on the screen, no filter, no performance, just two people standing close in the rain. She looked up and asked him, one more time, the same question from that very first morning, this time without a trace of the fragility it once carried. What did he think now? Daniel looked at the photo, then at her, rain gathering softly in her hair, and told her the truth. She wasn't merely pretty this time. She was happy, completely, unmistakably happy, and that was the only thing that had ever really mattered. That weekend, for the first time since he'd taken the consulting job, Daniel brought Maya to the office on a quiet Saturday morning while he finished a routine server check. She wandered the empty executive floor with a sketchbook under her arm, unbothered by the size of the building or the glass windows or the fact that a woman in a business magazine had once terrified 3 grown engineers. She found Vivian in her office, studying a spreadsheet, and asked her, with the blunt honesty only a 9-year-old could manage, why she looked so much less tired than the picture of her Daniel kept on his phone from the news. Vivian laughed, really laughed, the kind that surprised her own staff when they heard it through the door, and told her it was a long story. Maya said she had time. She left an hour later with a new drawing for the corkboard, 2 stick figures standing under an umbrella, holding hands, with Ms. Vivian written carefully above one of them in crayon. The broken computer that first brought them together had been fixed in 20 minutes on an ordinary gray morning neither of them expected to matter at all. What Daniel had actually repaired, slowly and without ever meaning to, was something far more fragile than any machine, a woman the world believed was untouchable, remembering how to feel like herself again. And somewhere in the process, holding his daughter's hand at the end of a hard, uncertain year, he'd found the same thing in himself. Welcome to Velvet Storiez Tales.